5 women married the same man. None of them knew about the others. Every marriage lasts less than an
Think about the last time you looked at someone you loved, truly loved, and believed every single word coming out of their mouth. Think about the feeling of that, the safety of it, the warmth of it, the absolute certainty that the person sitting across from you was exactly who they said they were. Now imagine finding out, years later, that not one word of it was real. Not the promises, not the declarations, not the tears, not even the name he gave you the first time you asked him who he was. That is not a thought experiment. That is the lived reality of 5 women in the city of San Francisco, California, who each looked into the eyes of the same man on 5 separate occasions across nearly a decade, and each one of them walked down an aisle believing she was the one, the last one, the real one. They were not. And the man who did this to them, the man who built his entire life and his entire fortune on the ruins of other people's trust, his name was Calvin Hines. And for a very long time, he was completely untouchable. 5 rings, 5 marriages. Not one of them lasted 12 months. And every single time, it was the woman who walked away with nothing. Calvin Hines walked away with more. He always walked away with more. That was not an accident. That was not bad luck or bad timing or the mysterious chemistry of 2 people who simply were not right for each other. That was his design. That was his system. And that was the machine he had built and refined and perfected over nearly a decade, one wedding at a time, in a city where money was power, and power meant you never had to answer to anyone. San Francisco called him a titan. His colleagues called him a visionary. The women he married and discarded had another word for him, but for a long time, no one was listening to them. This is the story of how one woman walked into his life like every wife before her, and walked out in a way no one saw coming. Not even him. Before we go any further, I want you to hold 3 questions in your mind as this story unfolds, because these are the same 3 questions that eventually brought Calvin Hines down. The first is this: how does a man marry 5 women in 5 years and never once face a consequence? Not one lawsuit that was held, not one criminal charge that stuck, not one moment where the system looked at this pattern and said, "Wait, stop, something is deeply wrong here." How does a man with 5 failed marriages inside 5 years remain not only free, but celebrated and respected, and invited to the right dinners, and photographed at the right galas, and trusted with other people's money? How does that happen in a country with courts and laws and institutions built specifically to protect people from exactly this kind of harm? That is the first question, and the answer is one that a lot of women across this country already know in their bones, even if the law has been slow to catch up to what they know. The second question is harder. And I say harder not because it is complicated, but because the answer is uncomfortable. What did these 5 women have in common? What was it that Calvin Hines was looking for when he chose them? Because he did choose them. There was nothing random about his selections. These women were not accidents. They were not simply the people he happened to fall for. They were targets, selected with intention and patience and a very specific set of criteria that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what each woman could provide him, financially, socially, professionally. When you understand what he saw in each of them before they ever saw it in each other, the whole picture shifts. It stops looking like a series of failed relationships and starts looking like exactly what it was: a system, a deliberate, patient, coldly rational system. And the third question, the one this entire story builds toward, is the simplest of all. Who was the woman that finally made Calvin Hines understand that for every system, there is someone out there who already knows how to take it apart? Calvin Hines was born in Oakland, California, in 1971. He was the youngest of 4 children raised by a single mother named Dorothy, he who worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood. One at a dry cleaning shop on Telegraph Avenue, and 1 cleaning offices downtown after hours. His father left when Calvin was 6 years old. Not gradually, not a slow fade into absence. He simply did not come home one evening, and Dorothy never spoke his name again in front of the children after that. Calvin grew up watching his mother exhaust herself to keep the lights on and the refrigerator stocked. And somewhere inside that watching, a something in him made a decision. He would never be on the wrong side of that equation. He would never be the one waiting. He would never be the one without. That hunger, that ferocious, unrelenting, consuming drive to accumulate and protect and never be exposed, was the one true thing about Calvin Hines. Everything else, from the day he became successful enough to construct a public image, was performance. By the time he was 25, he had his real estate license and a gift for reading people that bordered on surgery. He could walk into a room and within minutes identify who had money, who wanted to appear to have money, who was insecure about their position, and who would do almost anything to protect the life they had built. He was charming in the way that only truly dangerous people are charming. Not because he was effortlessly funny or naturally warm, but because he made you feel like the most seen person in the room. Like he had looked past everyone else, assessed them and found them wanting, and then turned and chose you. Women who met Calvin in those early years described it the same way, over and over, using the same language across different interviews and different cities and different years. They felt like a spotlight had been turned on them. They felt chosen. And that feeling, that specific, intoxicating, absolutely manufactured feeling of being chosen, was the hook. And he had been perfecting it since he was young. And by the time he was in his 30s, it was flawless. His first marriage, at 32 years old, was to a woman named Rachel. I am going to use first names only throughout this story. Not because these women have anything to hide, but because they have already given enough of themselves to this man, and they do not owe the world their full identities on top of everything else he took from them. Rachel was a 34-year-old elementary school teacher when she met Calvin at a charity gala in Pacific Heights. She was there with a colleague. He was there because he had paid $10,000 for a table, and the room was full of exactly the kind of connections he wanted access to. Rachel was not the wealthiest person in that room. She was not the most connected, but she was bright and kind and genuine in a way that Calvin recognized immediately, because genuineness was the quality he had learned to exploit most effectively. Genuine people trust warmth when they feel it. They do not look for the performance underneath. They feel the heat, and they move toward it, because that is what warmth is supposed to mean. He proposed to Rachel within 4 months. The wedding was modest by his later standards, a small ceremony in Marin County with about 60 guests. Rachel wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and cried through her vows. 8 months later, she was served with divorce papers while she was setting up her classroom for the new school year. A process server handed her the envelope between first and second period on a Tuesday morning. She sat in her car in the school parking lot for 40 minutes before she could drive. She told a friend later that the thing that shook her most was not the shock of it. It was that she had already been wondering if something was wrong. She had already started feeling the ground shift. She had already noticed the distance, the coldness, the way he had stopped making eye contact during conversations. She had already begun to feel like a problem he was in the process of solving, rather than a person he loved. She just had not understood yet that this was by design, that the coldness was not the end of something real. It was the wind down of something that had never been real at all. Wife number 2 was Diane. She was 41 when she married Calvin, a successful small business owner who ran an event planning company in the Bay Area. Diane was sharper than Rachel, more guarded, more experienced, with a quiet radar for the inconsistencies in people's stories that she had developed over a lifetime of building something from nothing on her own. She had been briefly married in her early 30s and carried the hard-won wisdom of that experience like a stone in her coat pocket. Something she was always aware of, something that kept her grounded when the world around her felt unsteady. She asked Calvin hard questions. She paid attention to contradictions. She watched whether his actions matched his words over time, rather than simply accepting the words at face value. And Calvin, to his credit, he actually registered her intelligence. Not enough to treat her honestly, but enough to work significantly harder on the performance than he had with Rachel. He lasted 10 months with Diane before he manufactured a conflict large enough to give him a clean exit. He told people in their shared social circle that she had been disloyal to his business interests. He said she had undermined him. None of it was true. All of it was strategic. When the divorce was filed, Diane fought back. She hired a good attorney and pushed for a full financial disclosure. Calvin's legal team pushed back harder and faster, and in the end, a prenuptial agreement that Diane had signed 3 weeks before the wedding. A document 67 pages long, delivered to her at 9 o'clock at night with a pen, protected almost everything he had. Diane told a friend after the divorce finalized, "I knew something was wrong the whole time. I just could not prove it." That was Calvin's genius. And it is important to understand this clearly, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. He did not just marry women, he built a legal architecture around each marriage, before each marriage, that made it nearly impossible for the woman to walk away with anything except her own name. The prenuptial agreements were ironclad. The asset structures were labyrinthine. And every single arrangement was designed to look, on the surface, like a reasonable and even generous provision for the woman. Until you looked closely enough to see that every dollar and every property and every account that actually mattered had been placed 3 layers of LLC beyond her reach before she ever said, "I do." Wife number 3 was Simone, 29 years old, an interior designer with a growing practice in the Mission District. Simone was the one who, years later, would give the quote that made its way into a dozen articles and at least one widely read piece of long-form journalism about marital financial abuse. She said, "He does not want a wife. He wants an audience." And when she said it, every woman who had ever been with a man like Calvin Hines felt that sentence somewhere deep and immediate, because it names something that is genuinely difficult to name. The particular and very specific loneliness of being in a relationship with someone who is performing love rather than feeling it. You are never truly alone because he is always present. But you are always fundamentally alone because the person who is present is not actually there. There is no one home behind the warmth. Simone lasted 7 months. She was the first of the 5 wives to speak publicly about her experience after the divorce. Calvin's attorneys sent her 2 formal letters asking her to stop. She did not stop. Wives. 4 and 5 were different from the first 3 in one very specific and important way. By the time Calvin married Patricia and then Gloria, He had moved well beyond the phase of simply wanting to exit marriages cleanly and keep his assets intact, and he had arrived at a more sophisticated understanding of what marriage could be used for. He had realized that a wife was not just a domestic arrangement or a social performance. She was a key. Selected correctly, she could open doors that money alone could not open. She could provide access to networks and relationships and institutional trust that a man with his history and his reputation, however carefully managed, could not access through conventional channels. Wife number 4, Patricia. He was 52 years old and a senior executive at one of the most prestigious luxury hotel groups in Northern California. She had relationships with investors and developers and city officials that Calvin had been attempting to access for years. He married her in October. The hotel group signed a $30 million development deal with his company the following June. She was served with divorce papers 3 weeks after the contract closed. Wife number 5 was Gloria, 45 years old, and the daughter of a retired Bay Area judge with deep and long-established roots in the city's legal and political community. Through Gloria, Calvin gained access to circles that his money alone had never been sufficient to buy him into. People who held influence in ways that did not appear on any balance sheet and could not be acquired through any transaction. He used 11 months of that marriage to consolidate relationships that he then leveraged in his business dealings for years afterward. Gloria did not fully understand what had happened to her until she sat in a restaurant in the Embarcadero 2 years later and watched a woman named Naomi Clark spread a financial diagram across the table between the water glasses and explain to 5 women simultaneously what their marriages had actually been. When she saw her own union mapped out as a line item in a transaction spreadsheet, Gloria did not cry. She told a friend afterward, "I want to be in that courtroom when the verdict is read. And I want him to know that I was watching him the whole time, even when I did not understand what I was watching." Now, here is where the story changes entirely. Here is where everything that came before, the 5 marriages, the 5 women, the 5 carefully engineered exits, stops being a pattern and becomes a target. Because in the spring of the year that followed Gloria's divorce, 2 of Calvin's former wives did something that none of his previous victims had thought to do. But they found each other, not through a mutual friend or a support group or any organized effort, through the specific and very modern fact of the Internet, where women who have been through the same experience have a way of locating one another that no amount of legal architecture and carefully managed privacy can prevent. Simone found Diane through a professional association in the Bay Area. They had coffee. They talked for 3 hours. And by the end of that conversation, and they both understood with absolute clarity that what had happened to them individually was not a series of unfortunate private failures. It was a single, deliberate, ongoing operation. And they were not its only victims. They reached out to Rachel, then to Patricia, then to Gloria. 5 women sitting in a restaurant in the Embarcadero on a Wednesday afternoon, spreading documents across the table between the breadbasket and the water glasses, building a timeline together for the first time. And they had all felt it, that particular bone-deep certainty that something was wrong, that the ground beneath the marriage was not what it appeared to be. But none of them had been able to prove it alone, because alone, each marriage looked like a private failure between 2 people who simply did not work. Together, they looked like evidence. The pattern that emerged from that afternoon was not just about Calvin's behavior inside the marriages, and it was about the financial structures that preceded each marriage, that ran in parallel to each marriage, and that were triggered with what appeared to be remarkable precision at the exact moment each marriage came to its manufactured end. shell companies, asset transfers, prenuptial agreements drafted by the same attorney. A man who, the women would eventually discover, had a conflict of interest he had never disclosed to any of them. Every marriage had the same fingerprints, and every exit had the same architecture. What they needed was someone who could take that pattern and transform it into something a court of law would act on. Not just an attorney in the conventional sense, but someone who understood, from the inside, how men like Calvin built these structures, and therefore how those structures could be methodically dismantled. Someone who had sat in enough depositions and enough courtrooms and watched enough of these cases go sideways to know exactly where the vulnerabilities were. That was when Simone mentioned a name. She had worked with her once, briefly, on a contract dispute 3 years earlier. A corporate attorney who had spent 20 years specializing in family law, who had a reputation in San Francisco legal circles for being the person you called when the other side had more money, better lawyers, and a longer history of winning. And you needed to win anyway. Her name was Naomi Clark. She was 48 years old. And when the 5 women sat across from her and laid out everything they had, she listened without writing a single note for 4 hours, and then she told them exactly what the traditional legal path would cost them and what it was likely to deliver. And then she said, "But there is another way." What Naomi proposed was not illegal, and it was not covert in any way that a court would find objectionable, but it was unconventional, and it required a kind of patience and emotional discipline that most people could not sustain across 14 months of being in close proximity to a man they knew was dangerous. She would enter Calvin's life as a potential romantic partner. She would allow the relationship to develop at whatever pace he set, and follow whatever script he deployed, because she already knew the script by heart, from 20 years of her clients describing it in depositions. She would agree to marry him when he proposed, and she would use the access that marriage naturally and legally provided to document, from the inside, the financial structures he had used against all 5 women. Not through deception about her identity. She was Naomi Clark. She was an attorney. And she told him she was a retired attorney the first evening they spoke, and he simply never asked the right follow-up questions. That failure of curiosity was his. She made one thing clear from the beginning. She was not doing this for herself. Every dollar of any settlement would go back to the 5 women at that table. She was doing it because she had spent 2 decades watching the same thing happen to women who trusted, and she had finally found a case where she could do something about it that would actually hold. Calvin met Naomi at a fundraiser for a Bay Area Arts Foundation in September. She had been introduced into his social orbit through a mutual connection arranged carefully enough to appear entirely organic. When he asked her what she did for a living, she told him she was a retired attorney who had recently stepped back from her practice and was considering her next chapter. That was not a lie. She had, 3 months earlier, replaced her active caseload with a trusted colleague and reduced her day-to-day practice specifically to create the time and focus this would require. Calvin was interested immediately, not because of her appearance, though she was striking, not because of her personality, though she was warm and funny and completely at ease in the rooms he moved through. He was interested because she mentioned, in passing and without apparent intention, on the name of a real estate development fund that he had been trying to secure a meeting with for 2 years. It was a name she had researched, a name she knew would land exactly where she placed it, and it landed precisely as calculated. He called her the next day. They had dinner 4 days later. Within 3 weeks, he was telling people in his circle that he had met someone extraordinary. He was right, of course. He simply did not understand yet in what sense, and the courtship that followed his established pattern with surgical precision. The acceleration of intimacy that felt too fast, but was delivered with enough apparent sincerity that you wanted to believe it was simply the natural speed of two people who were certain of each other. The early declarations that were too intense for the timeline, but were spoken with such controlled warmth that doubting them felt like a failure of your own generosity. And the gifts that arrived too soon and were too carefully chosen. Chosen in a way that said, "I have been paying very close attention to you," which is what every person wants to feel from someone they are falling for, and which in Calvin's case simply meant he had been cataloging information and deploying it with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. Naomi noted all of it, professionally, quietly. And she had seen this exact playbook described to her in depositions for 20 years. She was simply experiencing it from the other side now, and the experience confirmed what she had always suspected. It was not natural charisma running free. It was a script. A practiced, polished, nearly perfect script. But a script. He proposed 11 weeks after they met. She said yes. She called Simone that night from the parking garage of the restaurant where it had happened and said, "We are on schedule." The wedding was held in February at a private venue in Napa Valley. 200 guests, a string quartet, flowers that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Calvin stood at the altar in a suit made for him in London and looked, by every account of every person who was there, like a man who had finally, after 5 attempts, found exactly what he was looking for. He had. He had found the last woman he would ever underestimate. And before we go any further into what happened inside that marriage, before we follow Naomi through the 14 months that dismantled everything Calvin Hines had built, I want to pause here and ask you something. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if this story is already making you feel something, if you are already leaning forward, already thinking about the women you know who have been through something like this, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We are going to keep going, because what happens next is where the story gets extraordinary. The first 6 months of the marriage looked, to anyone watching from outside, exactly like what they appeared to be. A wealthy couple living well in San Francisco. Dinners at the right restaurants. Weekends in Carmel. Odd appearances at the kind of events where people pay to be photographed next to each other. But behind that photograph, behind the performance of the marriage that Calvin was constructing for the benefit of his social and professional circle, something else was happening entirely. Naomi was working. Every conversation that touched on his business interests was mentally catalogued. Every reference to a financial structure, a company name, a transaction in progress was documented afterward with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years taking notes in rooms where precision was the difference between winning and losing. Not secretly, she had been explicit with her legal team from the beginning that everything had to be obtained through means that a court would accept without question. She was not recording private conversations without consent. She was not accessing documents she had no right to see. Or she was doing something both simpler and more elegant than that. She was being a wife. She was asking the questions that a wife in her financial position would naturally and reasonably ask. And Calvin, who had spent a decade selecting women who were not sophisticated enough to understand the answers to those questions, was answering them. He showed her the shell companies because he was proud of them. And that is the thing about men who construct complicated financial architecture to protect themselves. They are proud of the structure. They built it. It represents, in their own estimation, a form of intelligence. Calvin walked Naomi through the entity structure of Meridian Holdings one evening over dinner at their home because she had asked, with apparent casualness and only moderate interest, how he kept his personal assets protected from the liability exposure of his larger development projects. He talked for 45 minutes. He drew a diagram on a cocktail napkin. He named the entities, explained the relationships between them, described how assets moved through the structure at different stages of a project's life cycle. Naomi asked clarifying questions with the expression of someone who was finding this faintly impressive and only moderately comprehensible. She memorized every word. The napkin, she later testified in a deposition, she kept in her purse for 3 months before turning it over to her legal team. It became Exhibit C. By the 8th month of the marriage, Naomi's team had assembled what a forensic accountant would later describe in court as one of the most thorough voluntary disclosures of concealed marital assets she had reviewed in 30 years of practice. Not because it had been subpoenaed or compelled by a court order or obtained through any adversarial process, but because the man doing the concealing had, in the context of what he believed was an intimate and completely private marriage, handed it over himself, piece by piece, or across dozens of conversations and documents and casual dinner-table references, to the one person in the world he trusted completely, who was, in fact, the one person in the world he should have been most afraid of. In the 9th month, Naomi's legal team made contact with a man named Marcus Webb. Marcus had been Calvin's personal assistant for 7 years. He was meticulous, deeply organized, and had spent those 7 years watching things happen that he had told himself were not his responsibility to address. He had watched each marriage. He had watched each exit. He had watched each woman leave with less than she came in with, and told himself that these were private matters between adults, and that whatever happened between a man and his wife was not something an employee had standing to question. He had believed that, or had tried to believe it, for a long time. He was not sure he believed it anymore when Naomi's attorney reached him. When the attorney asked him, at the end of their first meeting, how he wanted to be remembered, Marcus was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Not like this. Not as the person who saw everything and said nothing." What Marcus Webb provided was not just testimony. It was 7 years of careful and meticulous documentation, because Marcus was the kind of person who wrote things down and kept copies and maintained files, not out of any anticipatory plan to expose his employer, but simply because that was how he operated, and because some quiet part of him had perhaps always known, without letting himself say it clearly, that one day someone would need to know what he knew. He had records of asset transfers, and he had records of communications between Calvin and his attorney that predated each marriage by months, communications that discussed, in explicit and unambiguous terms, the financial objectives of each upcoming union and the exit strategy that would be executed once those objectives had been met. And he had records of instructions Calvin had given to delay certain financial correspondence directed to his wives, to hold documents long enough that specific transactions could be completed before the women understood what was happening to them. The case became public in November. When a journalist with a major Bay Area publication ran a story based on a tip from inside Calvin's own business circle, someone who had seen enough of what was coming wanted to be positioned on the right side of it before it arrived. The story described civil fraud claims being prepared by 5 former wives of a prominent Bay Area developer. Calvin's public relations firm issued a statement calling the claims baseless and politically motivated, and it was a phrase that made very little coherent sense in context, but it sounded alarmed and authoritative, which seemed to be the goal. By evening of the day the story ran, 2 members of Calvin's board of directors had called emergency meetings with their own personal attorneys. By the following week, His lead development partner had announced it was pausing all joint ventures pending a review of the allegations. The machine that had run so cleanly for so long was making a sound it had never made before. Calvin's legal team responded fast and hard. They filed a counteraction claiming that Naomi had entered the marriage under false pretenses, that she was acting as an undisclosed agent of business rivals, and that all evidence obtained during the marriage was therefore inadmissible. It was, on paper, a serious argument. It was the kind of move that, in an earlier situation or against a less prepared opponent, might have shifted the entire case. It did not shift this case because Naomi had anticipated it 18 months before it was filed. Every step she had taken inside that marriage had been documented in real time with a legal memorandum prepared by her team explaining, in precise and specific terms, exactly why that step was permissible under California law. Every conversation she had participated in had been one she was entitled to have as his wife. Every document she had seen had been one she had legitimate marital access to. She had not deceived him about her identity. She had told him she was an attorney on the evening they met. He had chosen not to ask what kind of attorney or what her practice had involved. That choice was his. But then came the 10 days that briefly looked like everything might unravel. Calvin's attorneys produced a witness, a former colleague of Naomi's from her earlier career, who was willing to testify that Naomi had mentioned Calvin Hines by name in a professional context several months before they had supposedly met organically. The argument was that the entire meeting, the entire courtship, the entire marriage had been premeditated from before the first conversation, and that she had concealed her true purpose from the very beginning. The press picked it up immediately. For about 10 days, the coverage shifted in a direction that was uncomfortable for Naomi's team, and genuinely frightening for the 5 previous wives who had been quietly waiting for the outcome. Was Naomi a vigilante? Has she gone too far? Had she, in trying to expose one person's long deception, engaged in a deception of her own that would ultimately invalidate everything they had built together? Calvin's attorneys held a press conference. They used the word entrapment repeatedly. The 5 previous wives went quiet on the advice of their attorneys. And Naomi said nothing. She had been saying nothing publicly since the beginning. She continued saying nothing. She was waiting. She had known this move was coming. Not this specific witness, not this specific angle, but this category of move. The attempt to reframe her as the villain. The attempt to flip the story from a man who had systematically defrauded 5 women across nearly a decade into a story about a woman who had gone too far in trying to stop him. She had prepared for it. And in the second week of what the press had begun calling the Battle of the Prenups, the piece of evidence that Naomi had been holding in reserve finally entered the court record. It was a voicemail, 47 seconds long. Left by Calvin Hines on the phone of his attorney Harrington during the 3rd month of his marriage to Naomi, stepped outside a restaurant where she had remained at the table, called from the sidewalk, left the message in a tone of casual confidence that suggested he had absolutely no reason to believe it would ever be heard by anyone other than the intended recipient. The voicemail was not obtained through any illegal or improper means. It was obtained because Harrington, effacing his own exposure from the conflict of interest investigation, had made the decision to cooperate rather than go down protecting a client who was, in his private assessment, going down regardless. In the voicemail, Calvin referred to Naomi by her first name and described his intention to transfer a specific commercial property in the Sunset District, valued at approximately $4 million, through Meridian Holdings and into a secondary holding structure before the end of the marriage, which he referred to as being roughly a year away. He used the word timeline. He used the phrase clean exit. He asked Harrington to begin the paperwork immediately so that, and I am quoting here from the court record, that things are already done by the time she figures out what happened. The voicemail was 47 seconds long, and it was played in open court on a Tuesday morning. The room was silent for the full duration of the recording and remained silent for several seconds after it ended. Calvin's lead attorney asked the judge for a brief recess. The request was denied, and in the gallery, in the third row from the front, 5 women sat in a line and did not look at Calvin and did not look at each other. They looked at the judge. They had waited a long time for this moment, each in their own way, and they were not going to miss a second of it. The civil judgment was issued 6 weeks later. The judge described the evidence as demonstrating a systematic and deliberate pattern of financial manipulation conducted under the protection of the marital relationship over a period of approximately 9 years. Calvin Hines was ordered to pay restitution to all 5 previous wives. The total across all 5 cases came to just under $2 million in direct financial restitution, plus legal fees, plus an additional punitive award that the judge described in her written ruling as necessary to communicate clearly that the substantial wealth of the defendant does not function as a shield against accountability for deliberate harm. His corporate holdings were placed under court-supervised financial review for a period of 3 years. So 2 major development partners formally withdrew from joint ventures. His membership in 2 prominent Bay Area business associations was suspended pending the outcome of the review. The empire that Calvin Hines had spent 20 years building had, in the span of a single Tuesday morning, begun its collapse. The press covered the verdict extensively. Most of the coverage focused on Calvin, on the mechanics of his fall, on the specific details of how the evidence had been assembled, on the particular quality of humiliation that comes from having your private financial arrangements described in open court as a 9-year fraud. Some coverage focused on Naomi, on the ethics of her methods, on the legal gray areas, on the debate between those who considered what she had done an act of justice and those who found her approach unsettling. Very little of the initial coverage noted what Naomi actually did with her settlement, perhaps because what she did with it did not fit cleanly into any of the narratives people had been constructing around the case. She gave it all back. Every dollar of the financial settlement she was legally entitled to as Calvin's wife, and under California community property law, she was entitled to a significant sum. She directed, through legal instruments her team had prepared before the judgment was even issued, back to the 5 women, split equally, and with a note delivered to each of them on the day the transfers cleared that read, "I did not do this to take anything. I did this so that what was taken from you might come back." It was not signed. It did not need to be. In the 18 months following the judgment, Calvin sold 3 of his 5 premium properties. The court-supervised financial review uncovered 2 additional asset transfers that had not been part of the original case. Transfers that predated even his first marriage to Rachel, suggesting that the architecture of financial concealment had been built into his business model from its very earliest days, long before any wife had ever signed a prenuptial agreement or seen a document arrive at 9 o'clock at night with a pen. And those discoveries led to an amended judgment that added to his financial obligations and extended the court supervision of his holdings by another 2 years. Within 24 months of the verdict, his empire had been reduced to less than a quarter of its former size. The man who had once controlled 34 properties across the Bay Area now controlled 9, and the man who had sat on charity boards and been photographed at galas and been called a visionary by people who wanted access to what he represented, that man was, in the most technical and complete sense of the word, gone. 9 months after the judgment, Calvin submitted a personal bankruptcy filing. It was a public document, as all such filings are, available to anyone with access to court records. In the supplementary personal statement section, where a debtor can but is not required to offer context or explanation, Calvin had written something. Not a legal argument, not a redirection of blame. Just a few sentences that appeared to be in his own words, transcribed into the typed document, sitting at the end of a long list of financial disclosures, like something that had been added late, privately, in a moment when the performance had finally become too exhausting to maintain. And he wrote, "I believed that acquiring the loyalty of others through strategy, rather than truth, was a form of strength. I understand now that it was the exact opposite. I caused harm that I cannot undo. I am aware of that." 11 words about the belief that had governed most of his adult life. An acknowledgement that the harm was real and permanent. And then, nothing. No apology directed at anyone specific. No names, no detail. Just those sentences in a public document, which is how they eventually reached the 5 women he had never said them to directly. Rachel saw them first. A friend texted her a screenshot on Thursday morning. She read it twice and set her phone down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a long time before she did anything else. When a journalist reached her for comment a few days later, Rachel said, "It is too little and it is too late. But I am glad that one true thing came out of him before it was over. I am glad one true thing exists." Diane did not comment publicly on the statement. She had, by that point, launched a second company, a financial advisory firm specifically designed to help women understand the fine print in prenuptial agreements and marital financial structures, the exact documents that had been used against her, and she had learned, from everything that had happened, to put her energy toward things that moved forward, rather than things that looked back. So Patricia had joined the board of a financial literacy nonprofit in the Bay Area, a cause she had become deeply committed to in the years since her divorce. Simone used a portion of her settlement to help fund the renovation of a women's shelter in Oakland, the same city where Calvin Hines had grown up watching his mother work 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Gloria became a family court mediator. As she said in a brief interview, that she found the work meaningful because it let her sit across from people in the worst moments of their lives and help them find a path forward built on truth rather than strategy. And Naomi returned to her legal practice. She took her first new client 3 months after the judgment closed. She does not talk about Calvin Hines much anymore, not because she is uncomfortable with what she did, but because, as she told a colleague, she spent 14 months thinking about him every single day, and she would prefer to spend the rest of her career thinking about other things. When a journalist from a national publication asked her, near the end of a long interview, what it had felt like to dismantle a constructed life from the inside, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way that people are quiet when they are not uncertain about what they think, but want to say it with precision. And then she said, "I did not dismantle his life. He did that himself, over 9 years and 5 marriages, 1 woman at a time. I simply made sure the rest of us did not have to keep paying for it. 5 rings, 5 victims, 1 woman who changed everything. I want to leave you with this, because I think it is the most important thing this story has to say. Not about Calvin, and not even about Naomi, but about the 5 women who came before. Rachel, Diane, Simone, Patricia, and Gloria did not fail, and they failed. There is a difference between those 2 things, and that difference matters enormously. Each of them brought their whole self into a marriage with someone who was never truly present in return. Each of them trusted. Each of them loved, or tried to love, something that was not real. And each of them survived it, and rebuilt from it, and went on to build something that mattered. They were not destroyed by Calvin Hines. They were used by him, which is not the same thing at all. And when the moment came to say so, in front of a judge, in a room full of cameras, with the full weight of documentation and evidence and testimony assembled by someone who had refused to look away, every single one of them showed up. I want to ask you something before you go. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong? Where the ground beneath you felt unstable? Where the story you were being told did not quite match what you could see with your own eyes? But you talked yourself out of it? Most of us have. Most of us, at some point in our lives, have convinced ourselves we were imagining the thing we already knew, because the alternative was too difficult to face. This story is about what happens when 5 women stopped telling themselves they were imagining it and started comparing notes instead. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Would you have had the patience Naomi had? Would you have walked into that courtroom? Would you have spotted the signs earlier? I read every single comment on this channel, every one, so tell me. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something you needed to feel, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because the next story we are bringing you will test everything you think you know about who gets believed in this country and why. You do not want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, the most dangerous lies are always the ones that feel like love.